We're going to talk now a little bit about the different immigration statuses that children may come to as they arrive in a new country, okay? It's very important for us to be aware of these different statuses because they can have an impact on the child's experience, okay? So first we're going to define what is meant by a refugee and refugee status. This is the definition from the 1951 Convention relating to the status of refugees, okay? And it says that a refugee is a person who, owing to well-founded fear of being persecuted for reasons of race, religion, nationality, membership of a particular social group or political opinion, is outside the country of his nationality and unable to, or owing to such fear, is unwilling to avail himself of the protection of that country. Unaccompanied minors are children who arrive to the new country without a parent, without a guardian, or without a caregiver, okay? It may be the case for unaccompanied minors that the parent has worked to get the children out of the country. It may be the case that the child is not born in the parent's country of origin, and the parent does not want the child to return to the country of origin, and so there's a shift to protect the child by getting them to a new country. Asylum seekers in the U.S. are children who are either unaccompanied minors or are dependents of parents seeking refuge. And asylum is applied for upon arrival to the host country, okay, rather than immigrating to it. So asylum is applied for when you get to the new country. So when you get to the U.S., you apply for asylum. It doesn't happen before. Undocumented children, and we heard a lot about this during our keynote presentation today, these are children and families who live in the host country with no legal status. And I really appreciated that distinction between civil rights and human rights, because the lack of a legal status really has an implication for the status of access to a civil rights issue. And so if we frame it in terms of human rights, then we really can be thinking about ways to support our undocumented children. So let's look at these sort of range of different statuses in the context of Latin America. One of the things I want you to think about is that Latin America has a lot of within-group diversity. These are the 20 countries and territories that make up Latin America. And so when we are working with a family or working with a child from Latin America, we want to understand what the experiences are within the specific country and the specific cultural context of that child's experience. And you can see these here. Beyond, we can't talk about everything in this presentation about children from each region, but here's some sort of global UNICEF data that I think really underscores the impact of this issue. So in the first 10 months of 2016, the number of Central American migrant children traveling through Mexico was almost 31,000. That was in 10 months. In the first 6 months of 2016, almost 16,000 children from El Salvador, Guatemala, and Honduras were apprehended in Mexico. And we're going to do a case study that talks about this second data here, which we'll refer to as the Northern Triangle region, and why that experience is currently happening. I'm not going to go through all of this, but as you can see from the data presented here, we could really look at this as Latin American children who are in a forced migration situation, that this is really a state of crisis. It is really a state of intervention, and it is a state of understanding for us to be responsive right, to the experience of these children. Again, looking at this within a human rights context. So, we heard today in our keynote presentation that there is sort of a decrease, right, at the Mexican border. And that certainly shows up in this data, that there is a decline for unaccompanied children and families at the US-Mexico border. However, there is a very big upturn in migration rates of undocumented children and families from El Salvador, Guatemala, and Honduras. And this is called the Northern Triangle of Central America. Why is this the case? So one of the things we want to think about when we're considering the experience of a child who's in a forced migrant situation or a family who's in a forced migrant situation, whether it's you're doing research on this or you're working with a child or a family in a clinical sense, is to think about what are, the literature talks about it as push factors and pull factors. What is pushing a child and a child's family out of a country, and what is pulling the child and the child's family to a different country? And here are some of the key push-pull factors that are identified in the literature. First is, and these are the push-pull factors that are predominant in the Northern Triangle region. The first is high levels of violence, okay? High levels of violence, and in this region we have the highest level of murders in the world, okay? So high violence. Food insecurity, so a lack of food, a lack of water, a lot of drought. So there's an issue with feeding one's family, having drinking water for one's family. Domestic violence is a very prominent theme for this region. And in fact, in 2015, there were research that showed that the women from this region had experienced extensive physical, sexual, and emotional abuse. And 82% of the women who were screened by asylum officers were found to have a legitimate fear of being persecuted. And then a final push factor here is government corruption. So those are some of the key factors that are pushing families to leave the Northern Triangle region. And then what are the pull factors? And our pull factor country that we're going to talk about today is the US. What are pull factors in the US that are saying, this is the country we're going to go to, this is what's pulling me? One is that there are people from the region already living in the United States. That was talked also about earlier today, that a family, an extended family, can have a range of different statuses within the family. And so that idea of that there are family members that you can be with that can sort of be your cultural broker to the country is a real pull factor for many families. Resources to expedite a hearing process, that also is a pull factor. However, there are funding issues that can lead to unexpected delays. And I want to just skip to this last point, which is, these processing lags, okay, can lead smugglers to say, right, okay, it's actually a processing lag, but in the country of origin, that's not known, right? And so the smuggler may say, well, that just shows, right, that the U.S. gave permisos, that the U.S. gave permission to be in the country. But in fact, it's a very different situation. So there is a misrepresentation of information that has an impact on families, which, as you can see from the push-pull factors, are largely women and children from the Northern Triangle region. So let's talk a little bit about mental health considerations for forced migrant children. Children, the research shows us, and it kind of fits with our sort of natural, intuitive process, that children who are exposed to war, children who have refugee status, are going to have elevated symptoms of post-traumatic stress, depression, anxiety, somatic complaints, sleep problems, and behavioral problems, okay? How many of you have worked with children who have been in a trauma situation? Okay. So then you understand that post-traumatic stress disorder shows up as sort of a recurrence or a reliving of the experience. This is how the trauma may get worked out for a child or for an adult. It's also a fear of a recurrence of the trauma, okay? And again, going back to the beginning of our talk today, when we think about a forced migration experience, this is a sudden, often a sudden, unplanned departure, right? And so what's also happening that could contribute to the traumatic event is that the life and the social support that a child has grown up with and has known literally gets ripped away very, very quickly. And because it is a departure, and it is truly a departure, right, there is no returning to that life, okay? And so part of our work as clinicians is to really help bridge, right, the loss of the country of origin along with the adjustment to the new cultural experience, to the new country. So a lot of the literature has talked about this idea of the dose effect, okay? And the dose effect says that basically the more trauma exposure a child has, the greater mental health issues they're going to have. So it's like a dose. The idea is that if you have more of something and if you have more trauma, you're going to have more mental health issues, okay? How many of you agree with that? Okay, how many of you disagree? How many of you are in the middle? Okay, let's talk about that. What we're seeing, and again, in this 21st century context, is that the problem is actually more complicated than that, okay? That we can't just assume that high exposure to trauma leads to high mental health issues. That there are intervening factors that can really mediate whether a high exposure to trauma is going to lead to any kind of traumatic reaction. So it is not necessarily a proportional relationship. And part of our work as clinicians is to try to tease out what is the relationship. Is there a relationship? And if so, what are some of those factors? So my colleague and I talked about sort of asking these following questions, right, to sort of challenge this notion of the dose effect, which intuitively we would think would be the case. But here are some things that we want to ask to think about this. If two siblings are exposed to the same levels of traumatic experience, will their mental health outcomes be similar? Okay, we want to look at that. In our work, we've found that that's not necessarily the case. There may be very different mental health outcomes, even though siblings have been in the exact same situation, okay? This may be mediated by developmental factors, age of the child, social support. We're going to talk about all those factors in a moment. The second question, here it is. What is the role of development and implications for developmental stage in mental health outcomes? Okay, so how does the child's developmental experience, right, influence what they're seeing? Okay, for example, and this isn't a forced migration example, and I'll give you an example. I was a newly licensed psychologist right around the time of September 11th. And one of the things that we did to support parents was to say, turn off the TV. Because if you were here and you remember that time, the World Trade Center was on the TV all the time, all the time, all the time. So a 7-year-old who is watching that developmentally is thinking or could think not that this is one occurrence, but that this is many, many occurrences that are happening again and again and again. And it's just a matter of time, right, if we take it to the next level, that it's going to happen in my neighborhood. And so all we needed to do there was to say to parents with children in this developmental stage, turn off the news. Do not have the media going on in your home because your child is worried that this is going to eventually get to your neighborhood. So we want to look at that developmental implication as a first step in understanding, is the dose effect happening or not? The second is, if a child is exposed to the effects of war as an infant, right, is the impact of that experience the same as the infant's neighbor who is 8 years old? Okay, again, this is a developmental question, okay? And then the last question, which is what we're going to spend some time talking about, is how do we explain differences in adaptation and coping among children who have a shared experience of consistent and ongoing trauma? So those of you who are clinicians who have worked with families who have experienced trauma, I'm assuming you've seen different levels of coping within the members of the family. And I'm assuming you've seen that some children appear to be coping better than other children, okay? So let's try to explore what that might be about. First, we're gonna say that, of course, there's a huge prevalence, okay, of PTSD among children affected by war, but look at the percentage. The percentage is from 7 to 75%. What does this tell us? It tells us that it's a lot more complicated than the dose effect, because it tells us that there is a huge range in the outcome among children who experience a war situation, who experience a trauma situation, okay, who experience a traumatic migratory situation, because it could be as low as 7%, and it could be as high as 75%. And APA has talked about that this range shows that our children are actually very good copers and have very good resiliency and resilience skills. And that's what we're going to be talking about. So we're going to move beyond the dose effect, and we're going to think about individual responses to trauma within different developmental phases. Okay. What we want to look at when we're working with children who have a forced migratory experience, who have experienced trauma, who have experienced a war situation, is we want to look at those contextual factors. Okay, what is the context of this child's experience? And so the first thing we want to look at is, what is the stress going on, right, post-war, right? What has the child seen? What has the child witnessed? What has the child given up in the country of origin? Okay. What are the social supports that the child has given up in the country of origin? What are sort of the stressors? And then we're looking at the pull factors, right? The new country of origin. What are the stressors related to resettlement? Okay, what might some of those stressors be? Things like adjusting to not having an extended family, things like adjusting to a new school system and a new sort of school environment, adjusting to a different language or being schooled in a different language, maybe being labeled as not being smart simply because you don't speak the language, and adjusting with that label. So we want to look at what happened before, and then we want to look at what environment did the child and his or her family move into. And the third thing we want to look at is we want to look at family functioning and caregiver functioning. Okay, so we're taking like a systemic perspective here. To what extent is the family able to provide support for the children? Okay, and this may be extended family, or this may be, a parent, if this is a child that comes to the U.S. with a parent. But we really want to explore what is the level of caregiving and support. Okay, so part of that is trying to understand, has the parent experienced a post-traumatic stress? Is the parent struggling with anxiety and depression? Are there mental health issues that have an impact on the parent's ability to be present for their child, right? Which would be totally understandable. For us as clinicians, we want to explore that because that parental support is very important for the child's acculturation to the host country. Let's look a little bit about what some of these protective factors are. I want to talk about resilience as a protective factor, and I want to just share how sort of 21st century approaches to resilience and how we're looking at resilience. Resilience, sort of 20th century definitions of resilience have looked at resilience as, well, an ability to overcome adversity, an ability to overcome challenge, but the research has largely historically focused on individual factors, and individual factors that promote resilience. So things like intelligence, motivation, social skills, ability to read, these are all individual factors. So some of us said, that's important, and individual factors are certainly important, but there are also larger contextual factors that need to be addressed. That just looking at all these individual factors puts resilience way too much on the child and makes it way too much the child's responsibility, right? So what are the contextual factors that promote resilience? Okay, so is it, for example, the concept in Latino culture of familismo, which is a real commitment to the family, a support of the family. The family is absolutely central, okay? That could be a resilience factor. Another sort of cultural aspect of resilience in a Latino context is the concept of personalismo, which is the idea of that a relationship, an interpersonal relationship, is valued for being an interpersonal relationship. It's not a means to get to something else, right? So for example, if you're doing business with somebody, you're not going to get right down to business. You're going to talk about family, you're going to talk about each other, you're going to build that relationship. Similarly, in a clinical context, okay, if we look at the concept of personalismo, I wouldn't jump in and talk about what the diagnosis is or what the presenting problem is or anything like that. The focus would be on, tell me about your name. Where did your name come from? Tell me about your family. It's about building that relationship. So these are just a couple of examples of how resilience can be a protective factor. Second, early intervention, parental support, and parental belief in a child's report of sexual abuse, okay, another traumatic experience, have been found to be factors that have really helped children heal from this experience, okay? And so the idea here, and we get back to the importance of the parent or the caregiver being present for the child. One of the factors that promotes children's healing from an experience of sexual abuse is that their caregiver or their parent heard them and believed them, okay, and got them the help that they needed. Cultural resilience, I've talked a little bit about. I also want to say that we are also, in the 21st century, really working to understand trauma and trauma reactions from a cultural perspective, okay? And so the idea here is that our culture and our cultural experiences influences how we understand trauma, okay, and how we relate to trauma. We did some writing about our experiences, after September 11th, and one of the things that we wrote about was, this idea of, I was talking about a woman who really felt that she could have saved her husband, right? He was in the tower and she felt she could have saved him, okay? She couldn't have saved him, right? She could not have saved him. He was on the top floor. She could not have saved him. But she blamed herself. And understanding trauma within a cultural perspective allowed us to see that the concept that was operating here for her was this concept of marianismo, which is the opposite of what we understand about machismo. We've all heard about machismo. We've heard less about marianismo. Marianismo is the concept that applies to women. And marianismo is the concept that says, my role as a woman is to protect my family and to protect my spouse and to protect my children. And if I can't do that, if I can't fulfill that role, it's my fault. And so, you could say, well, you couldn't have saved this, you couldn't have saved your husband, you couldn't have saved your husband. That would not have been clinically helpful. It was instead important to understand where this experience was coming from. And that's where, the intervention could take place. So we're really looking at these contextual factors in healing and understanding trauma and resilience from that perspective. I want us to have some time for questions. So I'm going to look at my phone. Yeah, we're good. We have just a couple of more things to talk about. I'd like us to think about this 6-point agenda that UNICEF has for children on the move. I think this is a very important agenda for us to think about in our clinical work with children, if we're doing research on children who have experienced this. The first is to protect uprooted children from exploitation and violence, right? To protect uprooted children from exploitation and violence. And that directly relates to the second point that UNICEF raises, which is keep families together, okay? Protecting children involves keeping families together. And we've seen a lot on a national, on a global scale of families that are torn apart from each other, right? And that is very much a traumatic experience for children and for parents. And then the second part to this second point from UNICEF is to give children legal status, right? To give children roots, to give children a home. And if it's a new host country, to give them a new host home. The third is to end the detention of refugee and migrant children by creating practical alternatives, okay? What are the alternatives, right, for children so that they are not detained? I had the privilege of going with a group of colleagues to present in Sweden last year, and we visited a school, and it was so interesting to learn that Sweden had opened its borders to so many undocumented youth who had come into the country, whose parents were not in the country but had sent their children to Sweden because they knew that their children would be accepted and they knew that their children would be safe there. And the children were going to school and they had host families. It was a fascinating and very humane approach to an alternative, right? In having children be children and supported as young people. Which also gets to our fourth point, is having uprooted stay in school and stay healthy, okay? Many times, through different traumatic experiences, I've worked with parents and said to them, your child needs to go back to school. And in fact, a lot of our parents after September 11th, for instance, didn't want to send their children to school because school's a government institution and they were worried that was going to be the next attack, or the water was going to be poisoned or something like that. And so all of that, right, of course, makes sense that you as a parent are feeling this way. But having children be in school does something developmentally that's very important for children. It gives children a routine, and it gives children an expectation of what their day is going to be like, okay? And if they've had a traumatic experience, right, being at school helps them not ruminate or rethink or relive because they're in school. Now, of course, there may be some of that, but it provides an outlet and a consistent place for them to be doing what they need to be doing. So school is very important. The fifth is to press for action on causes that uproot children from their homes, okay? These are all those push factors we talked about at the beginning of the presentation, right? How can we address food insecurity issues? How can we promote clean water globally, okay? How can we provide humanitarian aid to countries? Or how can we encourage countries, as in the case of Venezuela, to accept humanitarian aid, okay, for its people? So there are things that we can do that can address some of those push factors. And then the final one is combating xenophobia and discrimination. And I'll just say, because then we're going to open it up for questions, just an example of this, very fascinating. I grew up in Venezuela, and it used to be that Colombia, which is on the border of Venezuela, that there were a lot of, during the Civil War in Colombia, there were a lot of immigrants to Venezuela. And so Venezuela took in a lot of Colombian immigrants. Now the situation has reversed. So the Civil War has ended. There is a peace treaty, and the situation in Venezuela has worsened to the point that millions are leaving the country, and many are going to Colombia. And so I work with a fellowship program, and two of our Colombian fellows, our journalists, are doing a project, a journalism project, focused on some of the discrimination and xenophobia that now is coming out in response to sort of Venezuelans going to Colombia. So it's a very interesting shift, and history sometimes forgets, right? So it'll be interesting to see the outcome of that project.